The Roaring Twenties by Rachel, Vicky, and Daniela. The first Red Scare was a period during the early 20th century history of the United States marked by a widespread fear of Bolshevism and anarchism. Due to real and imagined events, real events include those such as the Russian Revolution and anarchist bombings. The 1919 United States anarchist bombings carried out by anarchist followers of Luigi Galliani from April through June 19. Luigi Galliani was an anarchist and advocated the use of violence to eliminate tyrants and oppressors. The Big Red Scare resulted in a nationwide crusade against left-wingers whose Americanism was suspect. In 1919 and 1920, a number of legislatures passed criminal syndicalism laws. These made unlawful the mere advocacy of violence to secure social change. The anti-immigrant feelings of the Red Scare were reflected in the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were convicted in 1921 of the murder of his Massachusetts paymaster and his guard. The jury and judge were prejudiced in some degree against the defendants because they were Italians, atheists, anarchists, and draft dodgers. The Prohibition Movement. The Aryan New Order was authorized in 1919 by the 18th Amendment as implemented by the Volstead Act, passed by Congress later that year. Prohibition might have started off better if there had been a larger army of enforcement officials, but the state and federal agencies were understaffed, raising serious questions as to the wisdom of further self-denial.
Gangsterism. Prohibition spawned shocking crimes. The lush profits of illegal alcohol led to bribery of the police. Violent wars broke out in the big cities between rival gangs, and often rooted in immigrant neighborhoods who sought to corner the rich market in booze. Arrests were few and convictions were even fewer, as the button-lipped gangsters covered for one another with the underworld's code of silence. Chicago was by far the most spectacular example of lawlessness. In 1925, Scarface Al Capone, a grasping and murderous booze distributor, began 6 years of gang warfare that nettled him millions of blood-splattered dollars. Al Capone was a mobster, crime boss, and boss of the Chicago outfit. Gangsters rapidly move into other profitable and illicit activities such as prostitution, gambling, and narcotics. Anti-immigration. The 100% Americans recoiling at the sight of this resumed new immigration once again cried that the famed poem at the base of the Statue of Liberty was all too literally true. Congress temporarily plugged the breach with the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. The Emergency Quota Act restricted the number of immigrants admitted from any country annually to 3% of the number of residents from that same country living in the United States as of the U.S. Census of 1910. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 was replaced by the Immigration Act of 1924. Quotas for foreigners were cut from 3% to 2%. The national origins base was shifted from the census of 1910 to that of 1890. These acts were fueled by nativist feelings and resemble the anti-immigration laws of the 1880s like the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Bushido Klan, an extremist, ultra-conservative uprising against many of the forces of diversity that was transforming American culture. At its peak in the mid-1920s, it claimed about 5 million dues paying members and wielded opponent and political influence. The importance of the KKK is that it gave radicals more power by organizing them. The KKK was at an alarming manifestation of the intolerance and prejudice, plaguing people anxious about the dizzying pace of social change in the 1920s.
Education versus science. The 1920s continued to make more and more states requiring young people to remain in school. Unfriendly fire from the fundamentalists, these old-time religionists charged that the teachings of Darwinian evolution was destroying faith in the God of the Bible. Numerous attempts were made to secure laws prohibiting the teaching of evolution. Entertainment. The Harlem Renaissance was an intellectual, social, and artistic explosion that took place in Harlem, New York. In 1903, when the first movie sequence reached the screen, The Great Train Robbery was featured in the 5-cent theaters, popularly called the Nickelodeons. Hollywood in Southern California quickly became the movie capital of the world. They originally had no sound. Motion picture really arrived during the World War, when it was used as an engine of anti-German propaganda. Movie stars would have much larger salaries than the President of the US and were known as political leaders. Inventions. Development of the automobile in 1890s and 1910s leads to mass production as Detroit becomes the motor car capital. It makes it easier to travel from one place to another than using a train. Henry Ford develops the assembly line, which helps with mass production of cars and industrialization. Cars began to shift to gasoline power, which creates a new industry. Hundreds of oil derricks shot up in California, Texas, and Oklahoma. Now there were buses and passenger cars. 1903, first prototype plane is created by the Wright brothers. Began to construct planes out of steel for World War I, though they were not very stable, often called flying coffins. Charles A. Lindbergh becomes the first to fly transatlantic from New York to Paris. Radios were invented and held news, broadcasts, and songs. Technological improvements made long-distance broadcasting possible, allowing information to travel faster.